Story 1: The Cabin That Remember Her. The first wrong thing was the second mug already sitting on the table when I came back from carrying in my pack. I had unlocked the cabin less than 10 minutes earlier, set my things on the floor by the door, and walked back outside for the rest of my gear while there was still enough daylight to make the trail visible through the trees. The place had looked as abandoned as the ranger at the station had warned me it would be: one room, old wood stove, narrow bed, a cabinet with 2 crooked doors, and a table pushed under the window facing the hollow. I remembered noticing the dust on the tabletop because it was thick everywhere except for one clean ring near the far side, as if something round had been resting there for years. When I came back in, there were now 2 enamel mugs instead of 1. Mine sat where I had left it near the stove, and another one, chipped at the rim and stained darker inside, sat neatly across from it in that clean ring of wood. For a moment I honestly thought I had missed it the first time, that tiredness and failing light had made me careless, but that explanation held only until I looked at the dust again. The second mug had not been lifted from some hidden place and set down roughly. It had been placed exactly where it had apparently always belonged. I told myself it was the kind of mistake people make in old places, where every object already looks half-remembered before you touch it, and I unpacked the rest of my food while trying not to keep glancing at the table. The cabin had the stale smell of shut wood, damp wool, and old ash, a smell so settled into the walls it felt less like odor and more like weather inside the room. I cleared a small space near the stove, set down the bread, beans, and wrapped meat I had carried up from the trailhead, then opened the cabinet to find a dented pan and a mismatched stack of plates. There were 3 plates the first time I counted them because I remember thinking it was odd to find an odd number in a place so small. When I reached back in after setting the pan on the stove, there were 4. 2 shallow ones, 1 cracked bowl, and a white plate with a faded blue rim I had not seen before, stacked between the others as neatly as if it had been there all along. That was the moment I stopped feeling merely tired and started feeling observed, not by eyes, but by the arrangement of things. Nothing dramatic had happened. Nothing had moved while I watched. But the cabin did not feel empty anymore. It felt like I had interrupted a routine and the room was quietly correcting itself around me. By the time I got a fire going in the stove, night had fully closed over the hollow, and the cabin windows had turned from cloudy glass into dark mirrors that only gave back a dim, warped reflection of the room. I kept busy because it seemed easier than sitting still and thinking too clearly about the second mug and the 4th plate. I split a few of the shorter pieces of wood stacked outside, brought them in, and lined them beside the stove in a rough pile, then stepped back to wipe my hands on my jeans. A few minutes later, after checking the latch on the door and unrolling my blanket on the bed, I noticed the wood had been restacked. Not scattered. Not knocked over. Restacked. The shorter pieces were laid in 2 careful rows with the bark turned outward, the way someone might arrange them if they cared about neatness for its own sake. I stood there longer than I should have, looking from the stove to the table to the bed, and the whole room began to feel subtly paired. 2 mugs. 4 plates. 2 rows of wood. Even the bed, narrow as it was, had its blanket tugged slightly back on the side nearest the wall, as if someone preferred the edge by the window and had made room beside it. That was when the shape of the wrongness changed for me. The cabin did not feel occupied by a presence in the usual sense. It felt like it remembered exactly how 2 people were supposed to live there. I tried to break the pattern on purpose after that, mostly to prove to myself that I still could. I moved the chipped mug from across the table to the shelf by the door, turned all 4 plates upside down in the cabinet, and tossed the carefully stacked wood back into the casual pile I had made before. Then I took my flashlight and went outside to breathe cold air for a minute, telling myself I only needed distance from the room, from the old smell and the feeling of being slowly arranged into someone else's evening. The forest beyond the cabin was quiet in the heavy Appalachian way, dense enough that sound seemed to go only a short distance before the trees absorbed it. No wind, no insects, no nearby water, just that thick waiting darkness between trunks. I stayed outside less than 2 minutes. When I came back in, the mug was on the table again, not across from mine this time but slightly nearer the center, like it had been nudged toward conversation. The plates in the cabinet were right side up. The wood was back in its rows. I remember standing in the doorway with one hand still on the latch, and what unsettled me most was not that the cabin had changed while I was gone. It was how little effort the change seemed to require. The room did not feel active. It felt practiced. I ate because the ordinary act of it felt necessary, almost defensive, and I kept everything simple so there would be less to notice: bread, beans heated in the pan, water boiled for coffee I no longer really wanted. I set one plate on the table and made a point of leaving the others in the cabinet, but when I turned from the stove with the pan in my hand, there were already 2 plates waiting beneath the window. The second had no food on it, yet it was placed at the exact distance from the table edge that a person might choose out of habit, not carelessness. My own chair, which I had left square to the table, was slightly angled now, while the other chair, one I had not even realized was tucked against the wall beside the bed, stood pulled out just enough to suggest someone had recently stood from it. I did not sit immediately. I remember the fire ticking softly behind me and the way the room seemed complete in a manner it had not been when I first entered, as if the cabin had been waiting all day for this specific arrangement to return. It was only then that I understood what I had mistaken for haunting. The place was not trying to frighten me out. It was trying, piece by piece, to put back an evening that had once mattered to someone and had never been allowed to finish. I should have left then, but the hour had already settled too deep into the hollow for that to feel like a clean decision, and the cabin had not done anything I could explain as dangerous, only personal in a way that made it harder to walk away from than fear would have. So I sat down because not sitting had begun to feel like the stranger choice, and I forced myself to eat slowly, watching the second plate without touching it. The fork beside it remained angled inward, set not for me but for the place across from me, and every time I looked away and back again I expected something on it that hadn't been there before. The silence in the room had weight now, not empty but occupied by the memory of routine, broken only by the soft ticking of the stove and the faint settling of the wood around me. When I finished eating and stood to clean my plate, I made a point of ignoring the second setting entirely, rinsing only what I had used and turning my back on the table longer than I should have. When I faced it again, the second plate was no longer empty. It held a smear of grease and a few crumbs gathered near the edge, and the knife that had been resting beside it now lay across the rim, angled slightly inward as if someone had finished before I noticed. Sleep never came the way I expected it to, but I still went through the motions because stopping would have meant admitting I was no longer alone in a way I could explain. I checked the latch twice, fed another piece of wood into the stove, and sat on the edge of the bed to pull off my boots, keeping my eyes on the table as if that might hold the rest of the room still. When I leaned back to set one of the boots against the wall, I noticed a hairpin lying on the floor under the bed frame, dull bronze with a dark stone at one end, something delicate enough that it felt wrong against the heavier, worn interior of the cabin. I was certain it hadn't been there earlier because I had crouched in that exact place to spread out my blanket. I picked it up, and it was colder than anything else in the room, not just untouched, but removed from the warmth entirely. I set it on the table without thinking, as if placing it there would force whatever pattern the cabin was following to reveal itself more clearly. I lay down after that without undressing further, staring at the low glow of the stove until my eyes blurred. At some point I drifted, and what woke me was not a loud sound, but the careful slide of a drawer opening, soft enough that it felt meant to go unnoticed, the kind of movement someone makes when they are trying not to wake another person. I sat up immediately, listening, and the room held still again except for the faint red seam of heat behind the stove door. The drawer in the cabinet stood open a few inches, and though I never saw it move, I knew it had not been that way before. I crossed the room slowly with the flashlight, and the floorboard seemed to answer my steps after I had already taken them, each creak arriving just a fraction too late, as if the cabin were repeating what I had done instead of reacting to it. Inside the drawer was a bundle of letters tied with faded thread, and though everything else in the room carried the dull neglect of years, those had been kept with care. I brought them to the table and untied them, expecting to find something clear, something that would explain the order the cabin was trying so hard to restore, but the pages gave me only fragments. Words that had faded into paper, sentences that broke halfway through, a name that appeared once and never again. What remained readable was enough to form direction without certainty, mentions of waiting, of someone expected, of time stretching longer than it should have. One page had the word still pressed deep enough to cut through the fibers. Another mentioned the road being impassable. None of it explained what had happened. All of it suggested something had not finished. When I looked up from the table, the room felt settled in a way it hadn't before, as if handling those letters had aligned something. The hairpin was gone, and in its place the second mug sat turned outward, positioned precisely where a hand would reach for it without looking. By then I understood that nothing in the cabin was random, and that whatever remained there was not repeating without awareness but restoring with intent, correcting small details until the space matched something it recognized as complete. That realization did not make it easier to leave, only clearer that staying meant becoming part of whatever arrangement the cabin was rebuilding. I rose from the table and returned the letters, not to the drawer, but to a narrow clean space on the shelf near the bed that I now realized had been waiting for them. Then I moved the second chair closer and set the chipped mug across from mine again, placing it where it had first appeared. The room shifted around those choices, not visibly, but with a quiet sense of rightness, like tension releasing from something held too long. The stove settled, the walls eased, and for a brief moment everything felt balanced, as if the cabin had reached the version of itself it had been trying to restore all night. That was when I heard the sound from outside, footsteps approaching across the porch, slow and deliberate, stopping just beyond the door. I stood quickly, the chair scraping louder than anything had so far, and waited. No knock came. No movement followed. But from the bed behind me came the faint impression of weight lifting, as if someone who had been sitting there a long time had finally stood up to answer. I left at first light, not because I felt chased out, but because the cabin no longer felt unfinished, and that made staying feel like intrusion instead of observation. I packed quickly, leaving the table exactly as it had been arranged, resisting the urge to change anything that might pull the room back into that restless state I had watched it move through all night. Outside, the morning felt sharp and ordinary, the kind of cold that belongs to early hours in the mountains, and for a while the normality of it pushed the cabin into something I could almost dismiss. I made it partway down the trail before that feeling stopped me again, not fear, but the same sense of incompletion I had felt inside, now reversed. I turned back and looked through the window from a distance. The table had been cleared. Both mugs were gone. The chair was pushed in. For a moment it looked empty again, as if none of it had happened. Then I saw the bed. The blanket was folded down neatly on one side, and on the table beneath the window sat two plates placed close together, with a small arrangement of dried flowers between them that I knew had not been there before. Nothing moved, and no one was there, but the room no longer felt like it was waiting. It felt like something had finally been received. I didn't go back. I left it as it was, and as the trail curved and the cabin slipped out of sight, I understood that whatever had remained there had not needed to be seen. It had only needed someone to restore the moment it had been holding onto, long enough for it to settle into it completely. Story 2, The Trail He Took Us Off. The first time I saw him, I didn't think anything of it because everything about him fit too well into the trail to stand out, the kind of presence you register without really noticing, like another set of footsteps that just happens to be ahead of yours. He was maybe 40 yards in front of us, moving at a steady, even pace that didn't change whether the ground leveled out or dipped, and I remember adjusting my own stride without realizing it, matching him the way you naturally fall into rhythm behind someone in a narrow space. My friend was talking behind me about something I can't recall now, something light, something that didn't matter, and I only half listened because my attention had already settled on the shape of the man ahead. He wore a dull, earth-colored jacket, something that blended into the trees whenever the light shifted, and he never once turned his head, never checked behind him, never gave any sign that he knew we were there. The trail itself was clear where we started, packed dirt pressed flat by repeated use, leaves crushed into the surface, and occasional roots exposed where the ground had worn down over time. It felt like a maintained path, something traveled often enough to carry a sense of direction without needing markers at every turn. I remember thinking it was good to have someone ahead of us, even if we didn't know him, because it made the space feel active, like we weren't the only ones moving through that part of the forest that afternoon. There was nothing wrong in that moment, nothing that suggested anything out of place. Just a man walking ahead of us, exactly where someone else should have been. We didn't make a decision to follow him, not in any conscious way that I can point back to now and say that was the moment we chose the wrong direction. It happened the way small things tend to happen on long walks, where attention drifts and then settles on whatever is easiest to keep track of. He became that point without asking for it. The distance between us stayed almost exactly the same no matter how the trail curved or narrowed, and every time he slipped briefly out of sight behind a bend or a thicker section of trees, he would appear again just far enough ahead to feel consistent, like nothing had changed at all. The ground began to soften underfoot in a way I noticed only after it had already changed, the packed dirt giving way to a thicker layer of leaves that shifted slightly when stepped on, muting our footsteps and making the trail feel less defined without fully disappearing. I remember thinking it was probably just a less traveled section, something that branched off from the main route but still connected somewhere ahead, and that thought was enough to keep me from questioning it further. My friend kept talking for a while, then fell quiet without either of us commenting on it, the conversation fading out naturally as the forest seemed to close in a little tighter around us. I glanced back once, not because I was worried, but because it felt like something you should do, just to check that the path behind still looked like a path. It did, but not as clearly as before, the line of it softer, less certain. When I turned forward again, he was still there, same distance, same pace, as if he had been waiting for me to look back before continuing. The first time my friend said something was off, it wasn't about the man at all, which I think is part of why we didn't stop when we should have. He pointed out that we hadn't seen a trail marker in a while, no paint on the trees, no ribbons, nothing tied to branches to confirm direction, and he said it casually, like he was making an observation rather than raising concern. I nodded at first without really processing it, then started looking more carefully as we walked, scanning the trunks around us for any sign we might have missed. There was nothing. Not even the faintest trace of old paint or worn markings that might have faded over time. I told him it was probably just a section that didn't need them, that the path was clear enough without markers, and even as I said it, I realized the path wasn't clear anymore, not in the way it had been earlier. It still suggested direction, but it didn't define it. The man ahead of us didn't slow or hesitate. He didn't look for markers, didn't adjust his pace when the ground shifted or when the trees grew closer together. He moved with the same steady rhythm, as if the absence of structure around us meant nothing to him. When the trees opened slightly and the light spread wider across the ground, I expected to see something that confirmed we were still on a maintained route, some sign of where we were in relation to the rest of the park. There was nothing there except more ground leading forward, and him already moving through it. We should have turned around at that point, or at least stopped long enough to acknowledge that we had moved into something that didn't match the trail we thought we were on. But nothing in the moment felt urgent enough to force that decision. It felt like we were already committed to a direction, and turning back would have meant admitting we didn't understand where we were anymore. The terrain shifted again, more noticeably this time, the kind of change that makes you aware of each step instead of letting you move without thinking. The ground dipped slightly, then rose, uneven and less predictable, with exposed roots and patches of loose stone that forced us to slow down. The trees grew denser, their spacing tighter, branches overlapping in ways that blocked more of the light, making the path ahead feel narrower even when there was space to move. The man ahead continued without pause, slipping between trunks and stepping over uneven ground with the same steady pace he had maintained since we first saw him. My friend called out once, just a short, casual "Hey," the kind you use to get someone's attention without expecting much from it. The man didn't respond. He didn't turn or slow or give any sign that he had heard us at all. The sound of my friend's voice didn't travel the way it should have. It carried a short distance, then seemed to settle into the trees and stop, like the forest absorbed it instead of letting it move freely. We didn't call out again. It didn't feel like something that would make a difference. By the time we reached the water, I couldn't have said exactly when the trail had stopped being a trail in any meaningful sense. There was no clear point where it ended, no moment where we stepped off something defined and onto something uncertain. It had thinned gradually, softened, and then simply ceased to guide us, leaving us moving forward because forward was the only direction that still felt continuous. The man ahead stepped down a shallow incline, and when we followed, the trees opened into a narrow stretch of river that cut cleanly through the land in a way that felt older than anything around it. It wasn't wide, but it was clear, the water moving slowly over stone, quiet enough that we hadn't heard it until we were almost on top of it. He stopped there for the first time since we had noticed him, standing at the edge with his back to us, looking across the water as if there was something on the other side worth seeing. We slowed without meaning to, the distance between us finally closing slightly as we approached. For a brief moment, I thought we were going to reach him, that he might turn, acknowledge us, say something that would bring everything back into a normal shape. Instead, he stepped forward into the shallow edge of the river, the water barely reaching his boots, and then he was gone. Not hidden, not obscured by light or movement. Just not there anymore, as if the space he had occupied had simply stopped holding him. Neither of us said anything for a few seconds after he disappeared, which I think was the only reason it didn't feel immediately impossible, because silence gave it space to seem like something we had simply missed. I stepped forward first, down the same incline he had taken, and into the shallow edge of the river, expecting to see him just beyond the angle of the bank or partially hidden by the reflection on the water. There was nothing there. The surface moved slowly over stone, clear enough that I could see the bottom without distortion, and there was no shape, no shadow, no sign that anyone had just stepped through it. My friend came up beside me and looked in the same direction, then further down the bank, then back the way we had come, as if the man might have circled around us without being noticed. The space felt too open for that. There was nowhere he could have gone without crossing our line of sight. For the first time since we had seen him, we were standing still with no reference point ahead, and the absence of him felt heavier than his presence had. It wasn't confusion exactly. It was the sense that something we had been following without question had just ended without explanation, leaving us in a place that didn't connect back the way it should have. We stayed near the water longer than we should have, not because we were trying to figure out what had happened, but because neither of us wanted to be the first to say we should leave and then have to decide which direction that meant. When we finally turned away from the river, we didn't turn back the way we had come, not exactly. We chose what felt like the most continuous line through the trees, the direction that matched the way we had been moving before the ground opened up. It wasn't a trail, not anymore, but it felt like one might form if we kept going. The forest didn't resist us, but it didn't guide us either. There were no markers, no worn paths, no breaks in the undergrowth that suggested repeated use. Just space between trees that allowed movement if you chose it. After a while, I realized I couldn't picture the way back clearly enough to trust it, not because the terrain had changed, but because it had never held a distinct shape in the first place. My friend said something about heading uphill, that trails usually followed easier ground, but even that didn't feel certain here. The land didn't offer the kind of clues we were used to reading. It just existed around us, indifferent to whether we moved through it or not. We decided to stay the night without saying it directly, the decision forming out of small practical steps instead of a single agreement. We cleared a space near a cluster of trees where the ground was relatively even, set down our packs, and moved through the motions of making camp with a kind of quiet efficiency that came from not wanting to think too far ahead. There were no other sounds in that place once we stopped moving. No distant voices, no signs of other hikers, not even the usual scatter of small animal movement you expect to hear when the forest settles. The silence wasn't empty, though. It felt occupied in a way I couldn't place, like something that had always been there rather than something that had arrived with us. We didn't build a fire. Neither of us said why. It just didn't feel like something that belonged in that space. As the light faded, I kept expecting to see movement between the trees, not something coming toward us, but something already there shifting into view if I looked long enough. Nothing ever did. The night came down evenly, without change, and for a while I thought that might be the end of it, that whatever had brought us there had already finished. I woke before the light fully returned, not to a sound, but to the sense that something had shifted just enough to pull me out of sleep. My friend was already sitting up, looking past me toward the trees, and I followed his line of sight without asking what he saw because I already knew. The man was there again, at the same distance he had always kept, standing just beyond the first clear space between trunks, facing away from us as if he had been waiting for us to wake. He didn't move immediately. He just stood there long enough for us to register that he was real again in the same way he had been before, solid, defined, placed exactly where someone could be mistaken for ordinary. Then he started walking. The same pace, the same steady rhythm, no glance back, no signal that he expected us to follow. We were already on our feet before either of us spoke, leaving most of our things where they were because nothing we had brought felt as important as getting back to something that resembled a path. We followed him the way we had the day before, not because we trusted him, but because he was the only direction that made sense again. The forest shifted gradually as we moved, not changing so much as reconnecting, the ground becoming more even, the space between trees widening just enough to suggest structure returning. The trail came back the same way it had disappeared, not all at once, but in pieces that eventually formed something we recognized without needing to question it. Packed dirt replaced loose ground. Markers reappeared on the trees, faint at first, then clearer. The man ahead reached a bend where the path widened and turned out of sight, and when we followed, he was gone again, not into the trees this time, but simply not there beyond the curve. We didn't stop. We kept moving until the forest opened enough to reveal the ranger station ahead, the structure solid and familiar in a way that made everything behind us feel less certain by comparison. There were people there, movement, voices, the ordinary signs of a place connected to the rest of the world. When we stepped into that space, the reaction wasn't immediate, but it built quickly, subtle at first, then undeniable. The way the ranger looked at us, not surprised exactly, but measuring. The pause before he spoke. The way he asked for our names as if confirming something already known. We answered, and something shifted in his expression that I still can't place clearly. He didn't say anything that explained it outright. He didn't need to. It was in the way he turned to call someone else over, in the way our descriptions matched something already written down, in the way the space around us felt like it had been waiting for us to arrive for far longer than we had been gone. Story 3, The Ranger Who Came at Night. The first time I noticed it, I thought it was just a branch settling under its own weight, the kind of small shift in the canopy you only catch because everything else is still enough to make it stand out. I was halfway through my patrol, moving along a narrow stretch of trail above the campground where the trees grew tight and tall, filtering the daylight into something thin and green that made distance harder to judge. Nothing below felt wrong. The campsites were quiet for that hour, fire rings cold, tents zipped, and the usual sounds were there in the background without drawing attention, boots pressing into dirt, the faint drag of leaves brushing against each other. Then something moved again above me, not at ground level but higher, along the branches where the light barely reached. I didn't look up directly. I only adjusted my gaze enough to follow the movement without making it obvious I had seen it. At first, it didn't register as a body. It looked like the pattern of the branches had shifted slightly out of alignment, like something had disturbed the natural order without breaking it. The only part of it that didn't blend in was the eyes. They were too pale, too round, fixed in a way that didn't match any animal I had seen in daylight. I kept walking, checked a trail marker, wrote it down, and moved on like nothing had changed. It followed. Not fast, not aggressive, just enough to stay with me. And almost immediately, I understood something worse than being watched. It was paying attention to how I moved. I've spent enough time in the woods to recognize patterns in movement, to tell the difference between something reacting to you and something moving on its own terms. Most animals follow a logic you can read if you've been out long enough: avoidance, curiosity, territorial behavior, all of it predictable once you learn the signs. This didn't follow any of those. I slowed slightly at the next bend in the trail, not enough to make it obvious, just enough to see if the movement above would continue at the same pace or adjust to mine. A few seconds later, it adjusted. That delay was the first thing that didn't sit right. I stopped and crouched beside a mark in the dirt, something small and believable, like I was checking a footprint or a shift in the ground. Above me, the branches moved again, then stopped, again just a moment too late to be a coincidence. I stood and reached up to adjust the strap of my radio, a motion I had done so many times it didn't require thought. A second later, something above shifted, and when I glanced up just enough to catch it in the edge of my vision, I saw something shaped like an arm lift toward its face. Not the same motion. Not clean. But close enough to mirror the structure of what I had just done. That was when it changed for me. It wasn't just following. It was learning what those movements meant. From that point on, I treated the rest of the patrol like nothing had changed, even though everything had. I kept my pace steady, stopped where I normally stopped, checked the markers I would have checked anyway, and adjusted my gear without letting any of it look like hesitation. Every movement I made felt like something I was now aware of performing, not just doing. Above me, the presence continued in that same delayed rhythm. I would pause, and a few seconds later the branches would shift. I would lean slightly to look down a slope, and then something above would angle in that same direction, not to see what I was seeing, but to replicate the act of looking. The delay made it worse, not better. If it had copied me immediately, I could have convinced myself it was instinct or coincidence. But it waited, then responded, as if it needed time to process what it had observed before trying to repeat it. Once, when the trees opened enough for a narrow beam of light to cut through, I saw more of it than I wanted. The body didn't sit on the branches the way it should have. It seemed to fold through them, too long in some places, too still in others, its surface blending almost perfectly with the bark. Only the eyes remained separate, fixed and unblinking. I finished the patrol without looking up again, but by then I already knew it hadn't finished with me. The first report came just after dark, a family from the lower campsites, and at first it sounded routine enough that I almost dismissed it before they finished speaking. The father did most of the talking while the others stayed close behind him, his voice steady but not entirely relaxed. He said a ranger had come by their fire and told them to keep it low, that there had been movement near the trail, and that they should consider leaving in the morning. None of that stood out on its own. We gave warnings like that all the time depending on conditions. What made me stop was how he described it. The ranger had stayed just outside the firelight, not stepping fully into it, and had taken too long between sentences, like he had to form each one separately before speaking. When the father asked if something had happened, the ranger repeated the same warning without adding anything else, the tone unchanged. I asked for a description, expecting something that would point to another member of staff. What he gave me matched closely enough to be uncomfortable: uniform, posture, radio, but then he added something I couldn't ignore. The man adjusted himself after every movement, slightly delayed, like he was correcting how he stood instead of standing naturally. That detail stayed with me as I stepped outside, scanning the dark line of trees. Nothing moved at ground level. But the canopy didn't feel empty. More people came in over the next hour, each one describing the same encounter in slightly different ways, but always with the same structure. A ranger had visited. He had given a warning. He had left without explanation. The differences were in the details that didn't quite line up with normal behavior. One couple said he didn't look directly at them, only just past them, like he understood where to face but not why. Another said he kept touching the radio on his shoulder, not using it, just placing his hand near it again and again like it was part of the role he was trying to hold together. That detail hit harder than the others because it was something I did without thinking. By the time the last report came in, the pattern had settled into something I couldn't ignore anymore. Whatever had followed me through the trees had taken what it learned and brought it down into the campground, shaping itself into something that could pass at a distance. It wasn't perfect. It didn't understand the details. But it understood enough to be accepted without question in the right light. When I stepped outside near midnight, the campground had gone still again, quieter than it should have been for that many people. I looked up before I could stop myself. Between the branches above the station, I saw the same pale eyes watching. This time they were lower than before. Close enough that if it wanted to come down, it wouldn't need to learn much more first. I didn't write a report that night, not because I didn't believe what I had seen, but because putting it into words would have forced it into something too clear, and nothing about it felt clear enough to survive being read by someone else. Instead, I stayed at the station longer than I needed to, listening to the quiet settle across the campground in a way that felt different from the usual drop in noise after dark. It wasn't just that people had gone to sleep. It was that something had moved through the space and changed how it held sound. I stepped outside again just before 1 in the morning and walked the edge of the lot without turning on my flashlight, letting my eyes adjust to the dark so I could read the shapes of the trees more naturally. The canopy above stayed still this time, or at least still enough that I couldn't track movement the way I had earlier. But every few steps, I caught small inconsistencies at the edge of my vision, shifts that didn't follow wind, angles that didn't match the branches around them. I didn't look up directly. I kept my head forward and let those movements stay peripheral, because I had already learned that looking straight at it only made it harder to understand. Somewhere deeper in the campground, I heard a voice carry briefly through the trees, not loud enough to be a call for help, just enough to suggest someone speaking. It stopped quickly, like it had been cut off mid-sentence. I waited for it to happen again. It didn't. Whatever was moving out there had learned how to enter the spaces people trusted. It hadn't learned how to stay in them. The next morning didn't fix anything the way I expected it to. Usually, daylight puts things back into order, gives you distance from whatever unsettled you the night before. This time it only made the details harder to ignore. I walked through the campground checking in with the sites that had reported the visits, asking the same questions in slightly different ways to see if the answers would shift. They didn't. The descriptions stayed consistent enough to confirm what I already knew. Same posture. Same voice. Same delay between movements and corrections. One of the campers mentioned that when the ranger had stepped away from their fire, he had moved in the wrong direction at first, like he had turned without understanding where the path actually was, then corrected himself after a second. That detail settled into place with everything I had seen the day before. It wasn't just copying movement. It was trying to understand how movement connected to space. I checked the patrol logs after that, looking for any overlap that might explain it away, but nothing matched. No one had been assigned to that section during those hours. No one had reported unusual activity. I didn't write anything down yet. I told myself I needed to see it again in a way I could follow, not just observe from a distance. By late afternoon, I had already decided I would take the same patrol route as the day before, not because it was required, but because it was the only place I knew where it had started. I went out earlier than usual, timing it so I would reach that section of trail before the light began to drop. The forest felt the same as it had the day before, which made it worse, not better. Nothing announced that something was wrong. The ground held steady, the air moved lightly between the trees, and the sounds were ordinary enough to ignore. I kept my pace even and my movements deliberate, not testing it this time, just repeating the same pattern I had followed before. It didn't take long. I felt it before I saw it, the shift in the canopy that didn't belong to the rest of the forest. When I allowed myself to look up just enough to confirm it, the eyes were already there, fixed on me from a lower branch than the day before. It had adjusted. That was the first clear difference. It wasn't staying at the same distance anymore. It was closing it. I didn't stop. I moved through the trail exactly as I had the day before, and above me, the movement followed, still delayed, still imperfect, but closer. When I adjusted my radio, it did the same motion sooner than before. When I paused, it responded faster. The gap between action and imitation had shortened. It was learning more quickly now. By the time I reached the point where the trail dipped toward the lower campsites, I understood that whatever it had been doing the night before wasn't a finished attempt. It had been practice. I stayed out later than I should have that evening, long enough for the light to fall completely and for the first fires in the campground to come into view between the trees below. I didn't go back to the station right away. I moved along the upper edge, watching the spaces between sites instead of the people within them, because that was where it had been placing itself the night before. It didn't appear immediately. For a while, everything held still, the kind of stillness that makes you question whether you imagined something earlier or if it had already moved on. Then I saw it again, not above me this time, but at ground level, standing just beyond the reach of a firelight circle. From a distance, it was almost convincing. The posture was right. The uniform shape was there. Even the way it held its shoulders matched closely enough to pass if you didn't look too hard. But once you watched it for more than a second, the delays came through. A shift that came too late. A pause that lasted too long. It spoke to the people at the site, and I couldn't hear the words clearly, but I recognized the pattern. Short sentences. Repetition. Instruction without explanation. The campers listened. They nodded. They accepted it. When it stepped away, it moved in the wrong direction first, just as one of the campers had described earlier, then corrected itself and disappeared between the trees. I didn't follow it immediately. I waited until the firelight settled again, then moved through the same space it had just occupied. The ground held nothing. No clear footprints. No disturbance that matched what I had seen. It wasn't leaving anything behind. It didn't need to. I returned to the station after that and filed the report I should have written the night before, but I kept it controlled, limited to what I could describe without trying to explain it. Another ranger read it later, listened without interrupting, and then told me there had been no one assigned to that section during the hours I described. He didn't dismiss it. He didn't confirm it either. He just set it aside in a way that told me it would stay there without resolution. The campground cleared out more quickly over the next day than it normally would have, not all at once, but steadily, as if people had decided on their own that staying wasn't worth it. That night, I stayed inside the station longer, telling myself I didn't need to go back out again, that whatever it had learned was already enough. But before I turned in, I stepped outside one last time, not to patrol, just to look. The trees stood still, the same as always, the dark holding its shape without movement. For a moment, I thought it might be over, that whatever had been studying me had taken what it needed and moved on. Then I saw it again, above the station this time, positioned between branches that should have hidden it. The eyes were fixed on me, closer than they had ever been, and when I reached up to adjust my radio without thinking, I saw the movement above begin almost at the same time. Not delayed anymore. Not learning. Matching. I didn't look up again after that. I went back inside, closed the door, and understood something I hadn't wanted to admit before. It hadn't been trying to become me. It had been trying to become something people would trust long enough to listen. And it was getting better at it. Story 4, The Crying That Came From Everywhere. The first night I heard it, I thought it was coming from down the slope below the tower, the kind of thin, uneven crying that carries farther than it should when the air settles after sunset. I had already closed up the lookout for the evening, logged the weather, and stepped out onto the narrow platform that wrapped around the cabin to take one last look at the tree line before turning in. The forest stretched out in every direction, layered in dark shapes that moved only when the wind found them, and there was nothing visible that matched the sound. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It was clear enough to separate itself from the rest of the night, a female voice caught somewhere between calling and trying not to be heard. I leaned over the railing and listened, trying to place it against the terrain I had been studying all week, tracing the ridges and dips I had memorized since taking the post. At first, it seemed to come from one direction, slightly east of the tower, where the land dropped into a shallow hollow. Then it shifted, not by moving, but by existing somewhere else at the same time. I straightened slowly, turning my head, and realized the sound wasn't traveling the way it should have. It wasn't echoing. It was present, equally clear, in more than one place at once. I stood there longer than I should have, waiting for it to resolve into something normal. It didn't. It only continued, steady, uneven, and patient. I went back inside and closed the door because that's what training tells you to do when something doesn't make sense in the dark. You limit what you can't control and stay where you have a clear line of safety. The tower cabin was small enough that every sound inside it had a place, the creak of the boards, the soft shift of the walls cooling after the day's heat, the faint hum of the radio even when no one was speaking through it. The crying didn't belong to any of those. It didn't get louder once I was inside, but it didn't fade either. It held its distance in a way that made it feel like it was sitting just outside the walls, no matter which direction I turned. I moved to the window and looked out again, scanning the tree line for movement, for any sign that someone had made their way up the slope without being seen. There was nothing. The forest held still, and the sound continued, not rising or falling, not approaching or retreating. I told myself it could be someone down on the lower trails, a female hiker separated from a group, the kind of situation that needed to be handled carefully, but even as I reached for I realized I couldn't give a direction to report. There was no point of origin I could describe. It was everywhere at once, spread thin across the trees like it had no single place to come from. The knock came not long after I stepped away from the radio, soft at first, just enough to make me question whether I had actually heard it. I stood still and listened, and when it came again, it was clearer, 3 short taps against the wood of the door, spaced evenly apart, deliberate in a way that didn't match the uneven crying outside. I crossed the room slowly, my hand already resting against the handle before I had decided whether I was going to open it or not. The crying didn't stop when I reached the door. It continued, unchanged, as if the sound and whatever stood outside were not entirely connected. I opened it just enough to see the platform and the narrow stretch of boards leading to the stairs. A young woman was standing, close enough that I should have heard footsteps if they had come up from below. She was average looking, in her early 20s, her hair hanging forward in a way that hid most of her face, and her shoulders moved with the rhythm of the crying that still echoed through the trees. For a second, I thought the sound was finally anchored to something real, that it had a source I could respond to. Then she looked up, and the sound didn't change. It didn't grow louder. It didn't quiet. It remained exactly as it had been before, spread through the forest behind her. She lifted one hand, not pointing, not quite reaching, just enough to indicate movement away from the tower. I didn't step out. I closed the door slowly, and the moment it shut, the knocking stopped. The crying didn't. It continued through the night in the same steady, uneven way, never rising into panic, never fading into silence, just present enough to keep me from settling into anything that felt like rest. I sat at the small table inside the cabin with the radio beside me, listening, trying to find some pattern that would give me a reason to act. Every time I thought I had found direction, it slipped again, the sound shifting across the trees without moving through them. At some point, I realized I was no longer trying to locate it. I was waiting for it to change. When the knock came again the next night, it was louder, more certain, like whatever stood outside had learned how much force it needed to be heard. I didn't go to the door immediately. I stayed where I was and listened to the rhythm of it, the same 3 taps, evenly spaced, repeated just long enough to demand attention without becoming frantic. When I finally opened the door, there was nothing there. The platform was empty, the stairs leading down into darkness without movement. I stood there longer than I should have, looking out into the trees, and the moment I closed the door again, the crying returned at full presence, surrounding the tower the way it had the night before. It didn't feel like something had left. It felt like something had been waiting for me to look. By the 3rd night, I was already standing by the door before the knock came, not because I was ready to follow it, but because I needed to see it again in a way that made sense. The crying had started earlier that evening, settling into the forest before the light had fully gone, and I could feel the expectation of it building, not in the sound itself, but in the way I was anticipating it. When the knock came, I opened the door before the 3rd tap had finished. The young woman was there again, in the same place, the same posture, her shoulders moving with the same uneven rhythm. Nothing about her had changed, and that lack of change was what made it impossible to ignore any longer. She raised her hand again, the same small motion away from the tower, and this time I stepped out onto the platform. The air outside felt colder than it should have, not by temperature, but by absence, like something had been removed from it. The crying didn't grow louder as I moved toward her. It didn't shift direction. It remained spread across the trees, constant and distant at the same time. She turned and began to walk down the stairs without looking back, and I followed, not because I trusted her, but because standing still had become harder than moving forward. She didn't hurry as she moved down the steps from the tower, and that was the first thing that made following her feel less like a decision and more like something I had already stepped into. Her pace was steady, careful, the kind of movement you would expect from someone trying to navigate uneven ground in the dark, and if I hadn't known what I had already heard for 2 nights, I might have believed that was all she was. The crying continued exactly as it had before, not louder now that I was closer to her, not quieter when I turned my head, but held at the same distance everywhere around us. It didn't match her breathing or her steps. It didn't even pause when she paused briefly at the bottom of the stairs to orient herself before moving into the trees. I followed a few steps behind, keeping enough distance that I could see where she placed her feet, more out of instinct than trust. The path we took wasn't one I recognized, but it didn't feel like we were forcing our way through anything either. The ground gave just enough to let us pass, branches parting where they needed to, as if the forest had already been shaped for this route long before I knew it existed. I tried once to mark direction in my head, to track where we were relative to the tower, but the sense of orientation slipped too easily. Not lost, just unanchored. The only constant was her ahead of me, and the sound that surrounded us both without belonging to either of us. We walked longer than I expected without any clear change in the terrain, the trees holding the same density, the ground rising and falling in small, manageable shifts that never resolved into anything I could use to place us. Every few minutes, she would slow slightly, not stopping, just enough to make sure I was still there behind her, though she never turned to check. The crying stayed constant, but the longer I listened to it, the more I began to notice that it wasn't a single sound repeating. It overlapped itself, like multiple voices layered just out of sync, all carrying the same tone but never aligning perfectly. That was when it stopped feeling like a young female somewhere in the woods and started feeling like something that had been stretched across the space instead of contained within it. I considered turning back more than once, but each time the thought surfaced, it faded just as quickly, replaced by the sense that if I stopped now, I would be left with nothing but the sound and no way to place it. She moved with the same quiet certainty, stepping over roots and uneven ground without hesitation, and for a moment I found myself matching her rhythm the same way I had matched the trail before, letting her pace determine mine. That realization should have been enough to break it, but by then we had already moved too far from anything that felt like a choice. The cabin didn't appear all at once. It emerged in pieces, first as a break in the trees, then as a darker shape within that space, and finally as something with edges that didn't belong to the forest around it. It sat slightly lower than the ground we approached from, set into a shallow dip that held the darkness longer than the surrounding area. From a distance, I could see a faint glow through one of the windows, just enough to suggest a light source inside, but not strong enough to spill out into the trees. She stopped at the edge of the clearing, her posture unchanged, her shoulders still moving with the same rhythm, and for the first time since leaving the tower, I felt the urge to stop as well. The crying didn't change. It didn't concentrate around the cabin or fade away from it. It remained exactly as it had been, stretched across the space behind us and through the trees to either side. She took a few more steps forward, then stopped again, as if she had reached the point she had been leading me to all along. I moved past her slowly, not because I trusted what was ahead, but because I understood that whatever she had been trying to show me was inside that structure, not in the path that led to it. The door stood closed, but not fully latched, the wood resting slightly uneven in the frame. I knocked once out of habit, the sound dull against the old wood, and before I could decide whether to step back or call out, the door shifted inward on its own, opening just enough to reveal the dark inside. The faint glow I had seen from outside didn't exist within the room. There was no visible source for it, only the impression that there had been light there at some point, recently enough to leave a trace. The air inside was heavier than outside, carrying the smell of old wood and something else beneath it that took a moment to recognize. Not fresh, not sharp, but settled into the structure itself, metallic, dry, the kind of smell that lingers long after it should have faded. I stepped inside without fully meaning to, just far enough for the floorboards to shift under my weight. The room was small, arranged simply, a table, a chair, a narrow bed pushed against the wall. Everything looked undisturbed, not abandoned in the way places are when people leave, but held in the state they were last used. Then I noticed the floor. One section near the back of the room sat slightly lower than the rest, the boards not quite aligned, as if something beneath them had shifted or been disturbed at some point. I didn't move closer. I didn't need to. The smell was stronger there, and the longer I stood inside, the more certain I became that whatever had happened in that space had not been brief, and had not ended quickly. I stepped back toward the door without turning around, the sense of the room settling behind me in a way that made it clear I was not meant to stay. I didn't see the young woman when I stepped back outside. The clearing was empty, the edge of the trees still and unchanged, and for the first time since the first night, the crying was gone. Not fading, not distant. Gone entirely, as if it had never been there to begin with. I stood there longer than I should have, listening for anything that might replace it, but the forest held only its natural silence, the kind that belongs to a place undisturbed. I made my way back without marking the path, and somehow the tower appeared ahead of me sooner than it should have, the structure rising out of the trees as if I had never been far from it at all. By morning, I had reported the location, described the cabin in as much detail as I could without adding what I couldn't explain. Later that day, I saw movement in that direction from the tower, figures moving through the clearing, the kind of controlled activity that meant something had been found. No one told me directly what it was. They didn't need to. That night, the forest stayed quiet. No crying, no movement, nothing that carried beyond the ordinary sounds of wind and distant branches. I sat inside the cabin of the tower longer than usual, waiting for something that didn't come. When the knock finally sounded, it was soft, just once, against the door. I didn't open it. I didn't need to. The silence that followed was complete, but it didn't feel empty anymore. It felt finished. Story 5. The food that was being taken slowly. The first thing that went wrong was small enough that I almost let it slide past me, the kind of thing that feels easier to blame on distraction than question directly. We had pulled our new RV into a quiet site near the edge of the campground, close enough to the woods that the trees stood like a wall behind us, but far enough from the nearest campers that their laughter came through only in faint pieces whenever the wind shifted. It was our first real trip in that RV, the first time it had felt less like something expensive sitting in our driveway and more like a place we were actually trying to live in. I was outside at the grill with 2 steaks going over a low, steady flame while she was inside rinsing vegetables and lining up condiments on the narrow strip of counter between the sink and stove. She called my name from inside, not with panic, just asking for help getting a pan down from the overhead cabinet because the latch had stuck. I stepped away from the grill for what could not have been more than 20 seconds. When I came back, the grate was clean. Not empty the way it would be if I had forgotten to put the meat on. Clean the way it would be if it had been scrubbed and cooled and never used at all. The steaks were gone. There was no grease, no hiss, no smell except hot metal. I stood there with the tongs in my hand, looking down long enough for her to call me a second time. When I told her what had happened, she gave me a look that was half amusement, half annoyance, like she thought I was trying to start a joke before dinner. We stepped back outside together, and the steaks were there again, exactly where they should have been, one edge darkening in the same place I remembered seeing before I went inside. We laughed because people laugh when the alternative is admitting something too early, and for a while the laugh worked well enough to move us forward. I turned the steaks, shut the grill, and told myself I had looked too quickly the first time, maybe at the wrong side of the grate, maybe through heat shimmer that made the whole thing seem momentarily empty. None of those explanations made sense even while I was thinking them, but they had the right shape, and sometimes that is enough to carry a normal evening a little farther. Inside, the RV still felt ordinary. The overhead lights threw that warm, enclosed brightness across the fake wood cabinets and the narrow dinette, and the fan above the stove made its soft, repetitive rattle whenever she bumped the counter. When the food was done, I carried it in and set the plates down while she reached for the steak sauce she had unpacked earlier. It wasn't in the cabinet over the sink. It wasn't in the drawer beside the stove. It wasn't by the paper plates or tucked beside the coffee. We checked outside, thinking maybe she had already taken it out there and forgotten. It wasn't on the picnic table, not near the grill, not in the outside storage hatch. We went back in and searched the same 6 feet of kitchen space in a way that quickly stopped being practical and started becoming mechanical. There are only so many places something can be inside an RV before the act of searching becomes an argument with the space itself. The bottle was gone, and the more we moved through the interior, the more the room began to feel slightly misaligned with the version of it we remembered from an hour earlier. We ate anyway because hunger gives structure to a night, and structure felt necessary by then. Outside, the clearing had gone quiet in a way that made the campground seem farther from us than it really was. I could still see another RV through the trees if I looked at the right angle, but the little sounds that should have connected us to the rest of the loop had fallen away. Inside, the smaller things kept going wrong in ways that would have sounded ridiculous if I'd said them all at once. She was sure she had put napkins on the dinette before I brought the plates over, but when we sat down there were none. I stood to get some from the cabinet and found 2 already folded on the counter behind me. My beer, which I knew I had opened outside while the grill heated, was sitting unopened in the refrigerator door. The can in my hand was half empty and cold. We didn't argue. We didn't try to force a conclusion. We only kept noticing, one detail at a time, with the uneasy patience people use when they suspect they are being watched but have nothing to look at. When we finally cleaned up and started getting ready for bed, she pulled back the blanket on my side and found the missing steak sauce standing upright in the exact center of the mattress, cap clean, label facing up, placed with a care that made it feel less like a prank and more like a correction. We looked at each other for a long time after that, and it was the first time neither of us tried to laugh. Morning didn't break whatever had started. It made the pattern easier to see. She woke first and went to make coffee, then called my name with a tone so flat it scared me more than if she had yelled. The grounds were gone. The bag she had put in the cabinet above the microwave the night before was no longer there, and neither of us could find it anywhere else. I opened the refrigerator to pull out eggs and found only 2 left in the carton where there had been 6. There were no shells in the trash, no pan in the sink, no greasy plates set aside. The bacon was worse in a different way. We had packed 1 unopened pack. There were now 2 opened ones in the drawer below the fridge, both partly used, both folded back with more neatness than either of us ever used when handling food. The case of bottled water under the dinette was almost empty. My first instinct was to count everything. Not because I thought numbers would fix it, but because numbers at least create the illusion of ground under your feet. We laid out what remained on the counter, comparing it against what we remembered buying before the trip, and what kept making my stomach tighten was that nothing felt stolen. It felt used. Reduced in ordinary amounts. Eggs missing the way eggs go missing when someone cooks breakfast. Water lowered the way it lowers when someone gets thirsty in the night. Nothing dramatic. Just evidence that the RV had not been unoccupied whenever we weren't looking at it. We should have packed up that morning and left. I know that now. But there is a point in certain situations where leaving feels like overreacting, and people will often choose embarrassment over caution just to preserve the idea that they are still reasonable. We did that. We told ourselves the space was getting in our heads because it was new, because everything in an RV is condensed and close enough that one missing object can distort your sense of everything else. We decided to take a hike to the overlooked trail near the creek, not because it solved anything, but because getting away from the RV for a few hours felt like a test. If the unease belonged to us, distance would settle it. If it belonged to the site, maybe leaving would reset whatever pattern had formed. We locked the door carefully, both of us checking it, then headed into the woods with the forced brightness of people trying to keep a day intact after something has already cracked it. The trail helped at first. The trees were open enough in daylight to feel ordinary, the air cooler, the ground stable. We spent longer out there than we planned, and by the time we turned back I had almost convinced myself that all we really needed was movement and perspective. That feeling lasted until we came out of the trees and looked toward our site. The RV was gone. Not damaged. Not shifted. Gone. The hookup lines and the parking pad were there, clean and empty, as if nothing had ever occupied the spot at all. We stood there too long before either of us spoke, and what hit me first wasn't panic. It was the awful, practical realization that whatever had been using the RV had not needed us inside it to keep doing so. We searched the site in the stupid, instinctive way people search for something far too large to have been misplaced. I walked the perimeter twice, checking the trees as if an entire RV might somehow be hidden just beyond them, while she stood at the empty pad staring at the hookups and repeating that we had locked the door, like the lock should still matter to a thing that was no longer there. There were no tire tracks cutting away from the site, no drag marks, no broken branches, not even disturbed dirt around the leveling blocks we had set the afternoon before. The campground around us still existed in that ordinary way that made our own site feel even more impossible. I could hear someone laughing from farther down the loop. Somewhere a car door shut. A radio played briefly, then went silent. Nothing in the rest of the campground had shifted with us. We were the only thing out of place. After a while we stopped pretending we would find it by circling and started walking toward the ranger station because that was the only action left that had shape to it. We left most of our day packs at the site without discussing it, which I think says something about the state we were in. We weren't thinking in terms of possessions anymore. We were thinking in terms of orientation, of getting in front of another person who could confirm the world still worked in a way both of us understood. The trail to the station cut through a stand of pines before joining the road, and when we came through that tree line and saw a familiar white RV parked near the overflow lot, my body recognized it before my mind did. The stripe along the side. The dent in the rear ladder. The little black sticker by the window we had meant to peel off and never had. It was ours. I knew it before I got close enough to read the plate, and knowing only made the next part worse. It wasn't parked alone. Another RV sat beside it, and 4 people were outside in folding chairs drinking from cans and talking like they had spent enough time next to us to become comfortable with our presence. One of them looked up when we approached and lifted his hand in the relaxed way people do when greeting someone they've already greeted earlier that day. He smiled and asked how the hike had been. Not if we had gone on a hike. Not where we had been. How it had been, as if it were part of an ongoing conversation. I stopped walking. She kept going 1 step farther than me, then stopped too. I asked what he meant, and the expression on his face changed just enough to suggest confusion without alarm. He said we had headed out late in the morning after mentioning the overlook, and then he asked whether we had found the creek crossing or turned back at the split. He knew details he shouldn't have known. Behind him, our RV door was open. I could see the edge of the dinette through the screen, and even from that distance something about the interior looked wrong. Not damaged. Not violated. Lived in. I told her to stay where she was and climbed the steps into the RV before anyone else could say more. The smell inside hit me first: coffee, cooked bacon, warm fabric, the normal smell of morning in a small space that had been occupied for hours. The blanket on the bed had been folded back differently. The plates we left in the sink were gone. The coffee grounds that had disappeared were now in the trash, used. There were 2 mugs by the sink instead of our 1 set of travel cups. It looked exactly like our RV and not at all like the one we had left. She came in behind me before I could tell her not to, and once she saw the inside she grabbed my arm so hard I felt her nails through my sleeve. Things had not been tossed around or stolen. That would have been easier. They had been adjusted into another version of our life. The condiments were lined up differently on the counter, grouped by use instead of by whatever cabinet had been closest when we unpacked. Our jackets were hanging by the door, but not on the hooks we used. The eggs were gone now, all of them. A cast iron pan sat drying by the sink even though we had never taken one out. The little details of occupation were everywhere, and every one of them felt like proof that someone had been moving through the RV in our absence not as an intruder, but as a resident. I opened the fridge because I needed one thing to remain exactly where we had left it. It didn't. The beer I had found unopened the night before was gone. In its place was a jar of pickles neither of us had bought. She whispered that we had to leave, not in the panicked tone of someone reacting to a threat, but with the calm of someone who had finally understood the rules of a situation and knew they no longer had any place in it. I stepped back outside to tell the people in the chairs we were taking off. One of them laughed lightly and asked whether we were sure, since we had just gotten everything settled. That word stuck harder than anything else, settled. As if the RV had reached the state it had been trying to reach all along, and we were the only ones still treating that as wrong. We packed fast, which mostly meant grabbing what still looked unquestionably ours and refusing to stop long enough to compare memory against what was in front of us. The people beside us didn't interfere. They just watched with the same puzzled politeness you'd show neighbors leaving suddenly in bad weather. Neither of us mentioned the food while we packed. It was there in every direction, the open packages, the wrong brands, the reduced portions, the sense of meals having been made somewhere just beside our own attention, but by then the larger violation of the space had swallowed the smaller ones. I started the engine and backed us out before either of us thought to say goodbye, and no one seemed offended by that. The road out of the campground was narrow and winding, lined with trees close enough to make it feel like the forest was pressing itself against the sides of the vehicle as we passed. For the first 10 minutes neither of us spoke. I kept both hands locked on the wheel and looked only at the road because every reflective surface inside the cab had begun to feel unreliable. Finally she asked, very quietly, whether we were going home or just leaving the park. I said home, but the answer felt temporary even as I said it. At the first turnout past the entrance road, I pulled over because my hands had started shaking badly enough that I could feel it in the steering column. She reached back into the cooler for water, opened the lid, and then went still. I already knew, before I looked, what had happened. Something else inside had been used again. The cooler had been fuller when we left the campground than it was 10 minutes later on the roadside turnout. That was the first thing I saw. The second was the sandwich meat, one packet already opened though neither of us had touched it that day. The third was a pair of plastic forks resting on top of everything else, clean but separated from the unopened pack they had been sealed in that morning. She didn't say anything. She only closed the lid carefully and looked at me in the same way she had looked at the steak sauce under the blanket the night before, less frightened by the object itself than by the care with which it had been placed. We sat there another minute without speaking. Cars passed occasionally on the road, ordinary people moving through ordinary time, and every one of them made our silence inside the cab feel more sealed in. Then I started the engine again and pulled back onto the road because there was nothing else to do. The changes continued all the way home, though never in front of us. A water bottle emptied between gas stations. Crackers went missing from a box I had wedged under the seat. The blanket in the back folded itself into a tighter square when neither of us had gone near it. By the time we reached our driveway, we had stopped checking immediately whenever something felt wrong. That was the final shape of it, I think. The thing no longer needed the campground or the clearing or even the RV itself. It only needed the space we had made around our living, and once it had learned that, leaving was never going to make us empty again.